The wound that the coping mechanism is trying to help us manage is festering, getting worse, becoming more painful, becoming more agitated, and it's just growing and growing and growing all the time inside of us. You see, we think we're managing it, but we're not. We're simply putting Band-Aids on it. And the whole time that we're putting Band-Aids on it, it's just getting worse underneath there. We have a little bit of perceived relief, right? We numb ourselves out. But just because we're numb to something doesn't mean that it's actually healing. Just because it's allowing you to cope with it doesn't mean it's doing anything internally to bring healing, to bring restoration to those parts of you inside that are in so much pain. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Permission to Love podcast. I'm Jerry, and I'm your host. I'm a Master Certified Mindset Coach, host of the Permission to Love podcast, author and speaker, and I'm so grateful that you're here with me today. So today I want to talk about coping mechanisms, how we are dealing with our pain, and the challenge of when our coping mechanisms become more painful or produce more pain in our life than the pain that we're actually trying to manage or the pain that we're trying to cope with. So what do I mean when I say coping mechanisms? Well, coping mechanisms are anything that we use to manage stress, difficult emotions, or pain, past pain, present pain, or anticipated future pain. Now, obviously, there are some coping mechanisms that can be very healthy. We take a walk, we exercise, we talk to somebody. So we're using all kinds of strategies all the time to deal with the emotions and the thoughts that we have. The challenge is when they become unhealthy, like drinking too much, overeating, workaholism, or anything that we're doing that we're trying to manage our pain with. You see, the challenge is we actually start getting wrapped up in trying to manage our coping mechanisms. We get into trying to limit our drinking or change our eating habits or whatever it is that we're using as a coping mechanism, and we're focused in on trying to manage that thing. But what we really need to ask ourselves is, what is the pain that coping mechanism is trying to help us manage? And that's okay, right? We all have pain. We all have experiences in our life, or we're all dealing with things in the current moment that are difficult to deal with. And we want to escape it. We want to get away from it. And then we turn to these coping mechanisms. The challenge is when those coping mechanisms begin to produce even more pain in our life, or they're not allowing us to deal with the pain that we have. So therefore, that pain is actually getting worse and worse inside of us. And we're going to talk about that today. Why those coping mechanisms are actually keeping us stuck instead of allowing ourselves to be with the pain and to heal the pain that those coping mechanisms are trying to help us manage. There's a great quote that says, "Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional." And here's the challenge. We're all going to experience pain. But when we choose unhealthy coping mechanisms, we actually increase our suffering, and we increase the suffering of those who are in our lives. And I do just want to mention before I go on, that coping mechanisms aren't always things that people would judge as bad. Some people would judge things like workaholism as good, or overachieving as good. And a lot of the people I work with in coaching are those high achievers who are pushing themselves to overcome a narrative of shame, of trauma, of pain, of trying to bury the way that they feel, or bury the fact that they don't like the life that they've created for themselves. And so they wind up burning out and self-sabotaging. And a lot of that self-sabotaging is a coping mechanism to disrupt the life that they don't want to live, to actually cause it to fall apart, because they want to escape a life that is causing so much pain, so much stress for them. So there are all these coping mechanisms that we often don't see as quote unquote bad, but they're actually having some very negative impacts in our life. Another coping mechanism that people often develop are thinking patterns. They begin to think that there's something wrong with them. They begin to criticize themselves, beat themselves up, and they begin to get all this catastrophizing thinking, or these negative biases. And those are coping mechanisms as well. The negative limiting mindset is trying to help you project into the future so that you can prepare for something that might go wrong, or to criticize yourself in the hopes that if you just beat yourself up enough, you'll change the behavior, you'll improve your life. But the challenge is, even though unhealthy coping mechanisms can serve us for a while, they ultimately start to produce as much, if not more pain than the pain that we're actually trying to manage. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you know that I had some really unhealthy coping mechanisms in my life. I was trying to get rid of the message that I was unworthy of love, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me, and that came from my childhood trauma and the resulting shame that I carried for over 4 decades. So I turned to several coping mechanisms in order to manage that pain. One was workaholism, or trying to be a high achiever to prove to myself and to others that I was worthy of respect and admiration. The second was a highly active inner critic, constantly beating myself up, judging myself, trying to shame myself into different behaviors. And then the third was drinking, where I was drinking myself to death, that ultimately led me to go to rehab and get the help that I needed to get. And I still remember vividly the day that I decided to check myself into rehab for as long as it was going to take to get me sober and keep me sober. What happened that day was I woke up to the fact that my coping mechanisms, the behaviors that I created to manage the story, the narrative, the pain, was increasingly getting more and more painful. I mean, it cost me relationships, it cost me my health, it cost me my peace. I mean, it was costing me everything, and it was about ready to cost me my job. I mean, everything was falling apart in my life because I was using these coping mechanisms to try to survive. And listen, there's no shame in that. If you've got coping mechanisms that you're using right now, way to go. Good on you that you've learned how to survive, how to try to manage the pain. But the question is your coping mechanism now producing so much pain in your life, so much collateral damage that it's no longer serving you? Because remember, we develop coping mechanisms to serve us. And so we don't want to judge ourselves for the fact that we have a coping mechanism, because when we judge ourselves, we close ourselves down to ourselves. We just want to get curious and discover, how is that coping mechanism serving us? What pain is it trying to help us manage? You see, for me, I wasn't even fully aware of all the pain that I was trying to manage because I wasn't allowing myself to see it, because I was medicating it all the time. And so if you're using coping mechanisms to manage your pain, you might not even be fully aware of the pain that's below the surface of all that. And you're going to have to become curious about that. You're going to have to begin to understand what is the pain that coping mechanism is trying to help you manage. And people usually get motivated to find that out, what the pain is, when their coping mechanism is producing so much pain in their life that they don't feel like they can continue to go on the path that they're on. If you're struggling with things like the imposter syndrome, feeling like you're not enough, or that you're uniquely broken, or that you can never change, I want to encourage you. Those are thinking patterns. They're limiting beliefs, and they come from our mindset. Our mindset is the beliefs that we hold, the way that we see the world, the way that we see ourselves. And the great thing about a mindset is that you can change it. And now I want to ask you a question. What would life be like for you if you didn't have those belief systems? Just take a moment and imagine that. Connect with it. Who would you be without the belief that you're an imposter, without the belief that you're not enough, without the belief that you have to do all of these things to be loved and accepted? Who would you be? Well, the good news is you can become that, and you do it by transforming your mindset. So if you're ready to let go of those limiting beliefs, transform your mindset, and create the life that you actually want to live, I want to encourage you to apply for my new one-on-one coaching program called Mindset Mastery. It's a 12-week program that I created to help you transform your mindset, to move you from those limiting beliefs that are keeping you stuck towards a growth mindset, an expansive mindset. Over the 12 weeks, we'll work together to help you create a clear and compelling vision for your life, to develop a healthy and self-compassionate relationship with yourself, identify and transform those limiting beliefs, develop a growth mindset, and most importantly, you'll have a partner on your journey. You don't have to do this alone. So if you're serious about transforming your mindset and letting go of those limiting beliefs that got you stuck and you feel like you can't move forward, then I want to encourage you to check out the show notes in this episode, or go to my website at jerryhenderson.org/mindset and apply for the program. And to celebrate the launch of this new coaching program, I'm offering $500 off the program to the listeners of this podcast. So when you apply, just simply note that you heard about the coaching program from the podcast. So don't wait any longer. Don't hesitate. Don't talk yourself out of it. Because remember, the most important relationship you have in your life is the one that you have with yourself. And it's time for you to show up for you like you've been showing up for everybody else. So what's happening when we're using these unhealthy coping mechanisms? Well, number one, we're producing more and more pain in our life and more pain in the lives of those who we love. And what that is doing is it's producing more shame in us, right? We're feeling worse and worse about ourselves because the drinking's gotten out of control. It's affecting our health, it's affecting our relationship, it's affecting our worth, or whatever the coping mechanism is, right? The eating disorder or the workaholism or over-exercising or whatever it is that you're using as a coping mechanism. It's now gotten out of control and it's not helping you manage the pain at the same level as it used to. So you're having to do more and more of it because you're on that dopamine treadmill, right? Where no matter how much you do that thing, it's just not taking away the pain as much. So now you start to feel hopeless. Now you're frustrated. And now you have all these symptoms that are happening in your life. And then you're getting stuck in a cycle of hopelessness and shame. You're feeling terrible about what you're doing to yourself. You're feeling terrible about the fact that you can't manage that coping mechanism. You're feeling a lot of shame about how it's impacting other people in your life. And you don't know what's wrong with you that you can't seem to figure out how to deal with that coping mechanism. Well, here's the challenge and here's the truth. That coping mechanism or some other coping mechanism is going to continue to show up in your life, right? Have you ever solved one coping mechanism only to move to another? And then people say you have an addictive personality or whatever the narrative or story is. It's because we're not dealing with the thing that the coping mechanism is trying to help us deal with. So until we get sick of the pain that the coping mechanism is bringing into our life, or until that pain from the coping mechanism exceeds the pain that we're avoiding, unfortunately, we're going to stay stuck in it. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, right? We can wake up before then and realize that we're worthy of a better life and begin to choose a better life before all the collateral damage starts to happen. But for many people, they need that pain threshold to get pretty bad with their coping mechanism before they make changes in their life. And that is exactly what happened for me on that day that I decided to go to rehab. I couldn't tolerate the pain of my life anymore. And I got desperate enough to dig into what was underneath the surface of that. Now, I'll have to admit, my first priority when I went into rehab was I just wanted to figure out how to stop drinking. I wanted to get rid of the coping mechanism. But while I was in rehab and I didn't have that coping mechanism available to me, I decided to go internal. I decided to figure out what was underneath the surface of how that drinking was serving me. What was I avoiding? And see, the other thing that began to happen in the absence of that coping mechanism is I began to see myself as worthy of doing the work. I began to see myself as worthy of healing the pain. Because that coping mechanism wasn't around me during that time, the shame of constantly engaging in drinking began to lessen because I wasn't engaging in it. And that allowed me to turn towards myself with compassion. It allowed me to move away from shame to curiosity and then into self-love and self-acceptance. So the cycle of engaging in unhealthy coping mechanisms is keeping us trapped in it because we need more of it to have the same impact. And we're also shaming ourselves and judging ourselves. And we're wanting relief from the shame and the judgment that we're heaping upon ourselves. And so we act out even more. We seek more of that substance or that coping mechanism to quiet our own voice. I often tell people what drinking ultimately did for me is it allowed me to tolerate my own presence. It got to the point where the coping mechanism had taken over and there was so much judgment and so much shame that the only thing that would quiet the noise and allow me to be okay in my own presence was to drink. But once again, as with any coping mechanism, it became less and less effective. And guess who I was left at the end of all that? Me. Here I am drinking to try to quiet the noise, to cope, but it's becoming less and less effective. But then I had the compounding shame of not being able to manage the drinking. And then I was left with even a more abusive inner critic towards myself, even more shame, and I couldn't escape it. Because what was happening is the second thing I want to talk about when we choose unhealthy coping mechanisms is the wound gets worse. The wound that the coping mechanism is trying to help us manage is festering, getting worse, becoming more painful, becoming more agitated, and it's just growing and growing and growing all the time inside of us. You see, we think we're managing it, but we're not. We're simply putting Band-Aids on it. And the whole time that we're putting Band-Aids on it, it's just getting worse underneath there. We have a little bit of perceived relief, right? We numb ourselves out. But just because we're numb to something doesn't mean that it's actually healing. Just because it's allowing you to cope with it doesn't mean it's doing anything internally to bring healing, to bring restoration to those parts of you inside that are in so much pain. You see, that can become the deception of a coping mechanism. It tricks us into thinking that we're okay, even if just for a little while. But what's happening is underneath the surface, the iceberg, right? It's just getting worse and worse and worse inside of there. And in many senses, that's a good thing because it's our systems trying to get our attention to let us know that there's something here that needs to be dealt with. It is you doing a loving act towards yourself for that pain to continue to get worse and worse so that you'll ultimately address it. Because listen, you are worthy of addressing the pain that you've been carrying, the shame that you've been carrying. You're worthy of healing that instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it, instead of just trying to manage it. And that thing that you're using to try to manage it is causing more and more pain in your life, so you see no escape. You can't seem to fathom a way out of it. I want to let you know there is a way out of it. And I believe one of the key places to start is to become curious about what that coping mechanism is helping you manage. So let's just talk about that just for a second. Let's talk about the curiosity. Because curiosity, as you know, is an energy shifter. It's going to shift you from the shame, the self-judgment, which is keeping you in the loop of going back to the coping mechanism. If you can become curious about how that coping mechanism is trying to serve you, and then you can see that what you're doing isn't a horrible thing, a terrible thing. Yes, it might be causing some horrible, terrible things in your life, but that doesn't mean you're a horrible, terrible person. You found something that's helping you get through life, to get through pain. And when we become curious, it can then shift us to self-compassion because you can see the part of you that's in pain, that needs the coping mechanism. And then once you've done that, you can then start to develop more healthy coping mechanisms that we'll talk about in another episode. But right now, we're just trying to get to that area where we can be compassionate with ourselves for having a coping mechanism. Because once again, as long as we're judging ourselves, we can't get down below the layer of the coping mechanism to find out the wound that needs to be healed. Now, unhealthy coping mechanisms, while they have served us, there comes a point to where they don't serve us, and then three things start to happen. One is we stay in a loop of shame because we begin to judge ourselves for using the coping mechanism, which then drives us to use the coping mechanism more. Two, the coping mechanism has less and less effect, or we find less and less relief in it. And three, the wound is just getting worse and worse. It's just beginning to fester more and more underneath the surface. And all of this is leading to a destination where life's going to implode on us, or the pain of what's happening in our life through the coping mechanism is going to be so acute, it's going to become so severe that we're going to wake up and we're going to choose to make some changes in our life. So if you're listening to this podcast episode and I'm describing you, you've got those unhealthy coping mechanisms and it's showing up with a lot of pain in your life right now and a lot of pain in other people's lives. And you're shaming yourself, and you're stuck in a loop, and you can't figure out how to get rid of it, and you don't feel like you have the courage to face the pain that coping mechanism is helping you manage and to mask and to numb. I want to encourage you. You do have the strength to do this. You do have the courage to face what's going on inside of you. You are worthy of healing the wound instead of just continuing to medicate it. Let me ask you a question. Have you stopped recently, just taken a moment to examine your life, where it's at, what's going on with it? And have you asked yourself the question, what happens if I stay on this path? if I continue to ignore the pain, if I continue to believe that I'm not worthy of healing, that I'm not worthy of love and good things, you see, that's often why we don't make changes, because we don't believe that we're worthy of them. We believe that we're worthy of the pain that we're producing. And we also don't believe that we're worthy of other people's love, and that's why we push them away with these coping mechanisms that begin to cause pain in their life. But I want to tell you, if nobody else has told you, you are worthy of healing. You are worthy of addressing the pain. You do have the courage. You do have the capability to face it, to honor it, and to heal it. So let's just talk about some things that can help move you from that unhealthy coping mechanism to some things that are more healthy, more life-giving for you. Because remember, you deserve this, okay? You're worthy of this. The first thing is curiosity. Become curious about what that coping mechanism is helping you manage. And one of the ways that you can do that is by identifying the triggers. When do you want to engage in that coping mechanism? When do you want to get a drink? When do you want to overeat? When do you find yourself engaging in toxic connections and relationships? What's happening in those moments? What's initiated it? Is it stress? Is it self-loathing? Are you in there beating yourself up? Has somebody else treated you in a way that's painful? I mean, what's going on? Because if you can identify the trigger, it becomes a clue about what you're trying to manage. So for example, if you're in there beating yourself up, telling yourself what a loser you are, that voice started because of something else probably that happened in that day. You might not have performed well in a task. You might have said something in a relationship that you didn't want to say. You might have done something that you don't feel really proud of. And so that narrative starts, right? But then underneath that, there's that behavior that you're beating yourself up for. Then you got to ask yourself the question, what does that behavior mean to you? I mean, if you failed at something at work, does that mean that you're unworthy of acceptance, of love, that people are going to think that you're a fraud, that you're an imposter? See, there's these feelings in this narrative that starts to happen from these triggers that we experience. And if we'll layer down beneath the triggers, we'll often find things that are a result of the trauma that we've experienced in our life or the pain that we've experienced in relationships. So for example, if you weren't safe in your home or you weren't safe in a relationship, unless you did certain things, right? Unless you behaved or acted in certain ways that might have caused you to develop a coping mechanism of being a people pleaser and thinking that you have to be perfect. And when your perfectionism fails you and you don't get it just right and you get criticized, that then might put you in a loop of negative self-talk, telling yourself what a loser you are and how you'll never get anything right and you're always going to be this way, which then you might engage in a coping mechanism to silence the thoughts and to silence the feelings. But for many people, they think, you know what? I just don't like the way that I feel. I'm a little sad, or I'm just off, or I'm frustrated, or I just want to quiet the noise that's in my head, and so I'm going to take a drink, or I'm going to take some substance, or whatever the story is, or whatever the action is. If we think that we're just trying to manage our current feelings or the current narrative in our head, that's one of the reasons why we might stay trapped in that coping mechanism. But if we can begin to thread back to when that stuff started to show up in our life and the message and the narrative that we got that causes so much pain, we can then see how this coping mechanism is trying to silence that, not just the way that we feel in the moment. And then we can start getting to the root cause. We can start healing those original sources of pain. And guess what? When you heal the original source of pain, you don't need the coping mechanism. And guess what? When you don't need the coping mechanism, you don't have all the pain, the compounded pain that the coping mechanism is producing in your life. So after we've gotten curious and we've identified some triggers, the next thing that we can do is we can start doing some replacement. And I know you're thinking easier said than done, or you might have tried this or whatever, but here's what I want to encourage you on. If you're coming at it from a different place, okay, that you're now beginning to understand the pain that you're trying to manage and you're having self-compassion, you can then move into other coping strategies and other coping mechanisms with a different energy. So one of the things that can help is finding that replacement when you're getting triggered. So identify what those triggers are, become very aware of them. And when you're getting triggered, and you're having all the feelings and the thoughts that go with that trigger, Have a different coping mechanism, one that you would feel better about, ready to go. It could be exercise, it could be a commitment to call a friend, it could be meditation or simply going for a mindful walk, but whatever it is, have something in the ready that you can replace that unhealthy coping mechanism with. Now believe me, it's not going to happen overnight, but as you begin to do some replacement, you're going to see some progress. You're going to see yourself shifting away from the one towards the other. Because a lot of times what happens with people is they're just trying to get rid of a bad coping mechanism and they don't have anything else to go to. They don't have any other outlet. And here's another tip. Your body and your brain are going to have to get used to that new coping mechanism. They're used to the old one, okay? But as you've had compassion on yourself and you're not shaming yourself for it anymore, and you're committing to going to something that's going to serve you better, and then you're patient with yourself and you stick at it, your brain, your body's going to get used to it. Because as you begin to heal that original wound, that original source of pain, that negative coping mechanism isn't needed as much. And so your system's going to allow you to relax and move towards something that's more life-giving, more loving towards yourself. Because as you're committing to love yourself and walk in a new energy towards yourself, that in and of itself is going to cause you to gravitate towards new, healthy, and more desirable habits in your life. So here's a little exercise that you can do. Do some research and make a list of potential new, healthier coping mechanisms or habits that you can begin to integrate in your life. And everybody's different on this. For some people, exercise really helps. For other people, acts of mindfulness really work, like breathing exercises, meditation. It might be a hobby you pick up. It might be a new social network that you want to engage in that has some of the practices and habits that you want to integrate into your life, and you can find the support you need with them to help make that switch from the coping mechanism that you currently have to the habits and practices that you want to take with you into the future. Now, the third thing is if you need help, please get the help that you need. I needed help. I went to rehab. I've worked with a therapist. I've worked with a coach. I've done the work not in isolation, but with somebody else. So if you need to go to rehab, if you need to go to a support group, if you need to hire a therapist, if you need to hire a coach, do it. You are worthy of the investment in yourself. Because if you stay on the path you're on right now, it's just going to be more pain, and that internal wound isn't going to heal. So you are worth this. Invest in yourself, show up for yourself, and decide that you want to create and live the life that you're worthy of. Because here's the thing about getting support and getting help. It allows you to become aware of the pain that you are trying to manage. Because sometimes we can't see it. It's become so buried. It's become so pushed down that we're not even really aware of it anymore. Or if we are aware of it, we're not aware of how it's affecting us. We just keep shoving it down because we think it's going to be too painful to deal with. And I'm not going to lie, there is pain in dealing with pain. Because the pain that we're carrying, that we're experiencing, came into us through pain. And sometimes it gets released through pain. As we address it, as we look at it, a lot of painful things come up. But the beautiful news is on the other side of that pain is a life of freedom, a life of love, a life of self-acceptance, a life that opens us back up to relationships, a life that allows us to engage in life. But avoiding the pain through coping mechanisms is just going to create more pain. The original pain is going to go unhealed, and we're just going to cause more pain for us and other people in our life because we're not willing to address that pain. And you see, one of the most beautiful things that happens when I work with people in coaching is when they begin to paint a vision of their life on the other side of the pain that they're avoiding. Because the life that we want is right on the other side of the pain that we've been avoiding for so long. And when we wake up to the fact that we're worthy of that life, and the only thing that's standing in the way between us and that life is the pain that we're not addressing, and we're just medicating it, when we get to that place and we get committed to doing the work, our entire lives can change. Because we get committed to ourselves. We get committed to getting out of our pain and stopping the pain cycle and creating the life that we now can see and creating the life that we now feel like we're worthy of living. So I hope this episode has helped you in a couple of areas. Number one, to stop shaming yourself for coping mechanisms that you've developed to keep yourself safe, to survive. Number two, to see how that coping mechanism isn't serving you. how it's just increasing the shame and it's doing less and less for you the longer that you engage with it. And then most importantly, that you can see that you are worthy of healing that pain and giving yourself the life that you so deeply desire. So I want to extend you an invitation right now. That's an invitation to give yourself permission to heal. Give yourself permission to heal that wound that you've been medicating, that you've been avoiding, that you've been coping with. Allow yourself to say the words, I give myself permission to heal. I give myself the permission to live the life that I'm worthy of. And I give myself permission to see that I am worthy of that healing and that I am worthy to create a life that I love and I actually want to live. Now, I want to encourage you, if you need some resources to help you on your journey of healing, of giving yourself that permission to heal, I want you to see the show notes in this episode. I've got a number of resources there. And you can also go to my website at jerryhenderson.org, or you can send me an email at jerry@jerryhenderson.org, and then I can send you some resources that might be helpful for you. Now, if these episodes are serving you and you've not yet had a chance to subscribe or to follow this podcast, I would encourage you to do that because that's going to keep you updated on when new episodes come out. And also, if you know somebody who's struggling with unhealthy coping mechanisms, I'd encourage you to send them this episode. You never know the difference that it could make in their life. Well, thank you for joining another episode of the Permission to Love podcast. And I want to remind you, as always, you are worthy of your own love.